Hey listeners, this is Peter, and welcome back to the History Shorts podcast. This humble show is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the globe, yours truly included, all in one place. Download Podcast Republic now, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. In the early centuries of the Roman Republic, long before emperors ruled with near absolute power, the city-state of Rome developed a quite unusual political mechanism to confront extraordinary crisis, the temporary dictatorship. Unlike the tyrants and autocrats of later Roman history, these dictators were legally sanctioned officials, vested with near absolute authority like you would think of a dictator, but only for a limited period and under strictly defined conditions. Here is the rest of that story.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941,
it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The origins of the Roman dictatorship trace back to the 5th century BCE, a period of rapid expansion, social tension, and military threat. Rome, a city of modest size by modern standards that is, but still a dominant regional power in central Italy, was frequently embroiled in conflicts with neighboring Latin cities. Etruscan kings and rebellious tribes along the Tiber. At the time, internal disputes between patricians and plebeians, the hereditary elite and the common populace, threatened to destabilize governance. In response to all of these pressures, the Roman constitution, still evolving from its monarchy past, provided for a mechanism that could unite the state under a single decisive authority when collective deliberation proved insufficient. A dictator, essentially, was appointed by one of the sitting consuls, the Republic's chief magistrates, but only with the approval of the entire Senate. Once appointed, this dictator assumed powers far exceeding those of ordinary magistrates. He could command armies, enact laws, override judicial proceedings, and mobilize the city's resources without the usual checks and balances. Yet these powers all came with very strict temporal and procedural limitations. The dictatorship was traditionally capped at 6 months, after which the office would automatically expire. Moreover, the dictator was expected to relinquish authority immediately upon completing the specific task for which he was being appointed. In theory, this temporary concentration of power prevented the rise of tyranny while ensuring that the Republic could respond decisively to any emergency. The first recorded use of the dictatorship occurred in 501 BCE, when Rome faced a crisis from the Sabines, a neighboring tribe. According to Livy, the Senate appointed Titus Larsius as the first dictator to coordinate the defense and mobilize Roman forces. Larsius' role was not to rule permanently, but to act as a single, unified authority capable of decisive action while the Republic's regular institutions were insufficient. His appointment set the precedent for a model that would be invoked repeatedly over the next several centuries, particularly in times of war, rebellion, or internal political strife. Military emergencies were the most common justification for appointing a temporary dictator. The Republic's armies were composed primarily of citizen soldiers, whose effectiveness depended on discipline, coordination, and the authority of a singular commander in battle. In campaigns against hostile neighbors or during revolts in Roman territories, the usual dual consul system was sometimes seen as just too slow or prone to indecision. By placing supreme authority in the hands of one individual, the Senate ensured that orders were clear, rapid, and binding. Notable examples include the dictatorship of Cincinnatus in 458 BCE, perhaps the most celebrated figure in Roman Republican tradition. Cincinnatus was appointed to defend Rome against another neighboring tribe, and within 16 days, he had mobilized an army, defeated the enemy, and then resigned his office, simply returning to his farm. This story became emblematic of Roman civic virtue, illustrating the ideal that absolute power, when wielded temporarily and responsibly, could serve the common good without corrupting the individual. While military crises were a common trigger, temporary dictatorships were also employed to resolve internal crises. Rome's complex social structure was prone to disputes between patricians and plebeians, as I mentioned in the intro, particularly over land, debt, and political representation. On several occasions, dictators were appointed to oversee elections, suppress civil disorder, or enforce law and order during periods of civil unrest. These appointments symbolized the Republic's dual commitment to both security and legality. The dictator could act decisively, but only within the parameters set by law and the Senate's mandate. Interestingly, the dictatorship evolved over time to also include specialized functions. One such adaptation was the appointment of a dictator, and I quote, "for the purpose of getting things done," end quote. Of course, this was in Latin, but you get the point. This allowed for extraordinary authority to manage specific administrative or judicial tasks. Another form was appointed for highly ritualized purposes, such as the insertion of a nail into the temple of Jupiter during omens of crisis, a symbolic act meant to secure divine favor for the state. These ritualized or administrative dictatorships illustrate the Republic's blending of practical governance with religious observance, a hallmark of all Roman political culture at the time. Despite the clear legal framework, the office of dictator was not without controversy. The concentration of power, even for 6 months, was inherently very dangerous. Rome's history demonstrates that extraordinary authority could tempt ambitious men to exceed their mandate. Early historians such as Livy and Dionysius repeatedly stressed the moral and civic restraint expected of dictators, often framing the office as a test of character. Cincinnatus, Camillus, and other celebrated figures became exemplars of virtue, not simply because they wielded power, but more importantly because they relinquished that power so promptly. Conversely, instances of abuse, though very rare in the Republican period, highlighted the persistent tension between necessity and liberty in Roman governance. Now, that's not to say that people took advantage and stayed past 6 months. It just means that some individuals, very rarely, had a very hard time letting go after 6 months. In a society that revered law, tradition, and collective decision-making, the appointment of a dictator was a public acknowledgement that circumstances had exceeded ordinary channels of governance. It essentially represented both trust and accountability. The Senate and the people entrusted this one man with unparalleled power. As Rome expanded and its military and political challenges grew, the institution of the dictatorship was invoked more and more frequently, particularly during the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. Wars against the Gauls or other Italian tribes often saw the temporary dictator at the forefront of strategy and command. By the time of the Second Punic War, Rome's institutional memory of the dictatorship was well established, providing a mechanism for centralized command wherein Hannibal's campaigns threatened the Italian heartland. Historical records do emphasize the efficiency and decisiveness that dictators could bring, yet they also highlight the Republic's enduring vigilance against the accumulation of permanent authority. Over time, however, the temporary dictatorship also exposed many vulnerabilities in the Republican system. The theoretical limits on power relied entirely on the integrity of the single person or office holder. Ambitious men could manipulate emergencies to extend authority or bypass customary constraints. By the late Republic, figures such as Sulla and later Julius Caesar would exploit this very principle, claiming extraordinary powers for increasingly indefinite periods, saying it was essentially for the Republic's security. Sulla's unprecedented assumption of dictatorship in 82 BCE, which allowed him to enact sweeping constitutional reforms and execute political enemies, transformed the institution from a temporary emergency measure into a pathway to personal domination. Julius Caesar's appointment as dictator for life would eventually shatter the republican ideal altogether, demonstrating the latent dangers inherent in even a carefully circumscribed concentration of power. Either way, though, the temporary dictatorship of the early republic definitely remains a remarkable innovation in political governance. Hopefully today's episode has inspired you to seek out and learn more about this subject. For answers to questions, for sources for this episode, or to leave a comment or check out upcoming guest announcements, visit www.historyshortspodcast.com or look for History Shorts Podcast on Facebook and X. Stay curious, and I will talk to you all tomorrow.